Hola, amigos and amiguettes. We're back with another episode of Personality Picks, and we have another great guest, the man himself, Eric Betts Fights. Eric, how are you doing?
I'm feeling good, Wiz. How are you feeling tonight?
Doing well, doing well. Finally have you on here, dude. I've been waiting for this one.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. Yeah, I've watched the show. I think it's a lot of fun. It's cool to learn a little bit more about some of the Twitter personalities and even fighters. I saw that you had Damon Jackson on. That's pretty cool. So yeah, I love blabbing about mixed martial arts and being a mixed martial arts fan. So I'm definitely more than happy to do that.
Yes, sir. Shout out to the chat. Uncle Lou. I know he just hit his football bet that we were talking about yesterday, so shout out to him. Well, let's get right into it. Eric, how did you get into like the MMA scene?
Um, as far as getting into MMA in general, honestly, I think I was pretty much born obsessed with martial arts. Like for as long as I can remember, I always loved martial arts, even when I was like 4 years old or something. And I grew up in I was a kid in the '80s and kind of when the ninja boom was going on and stuff, and like there was a lot of cheesy martial arts movies coming out, Van Damme and stuff like that. And I was just obsessed with all of that, with Jean Claude Van Damme, with ninjas, with martial arts movies. Um, and then I first heard about the UFC in a magazine. I used to buy a lot of martial arts magazines. Like it isn't so much that way anymore. Like you used to
Mhm.
be able to just walk into any drugstore or whatever, and there was Ninja magazine and Black Belt magazine and all kinds of different things. And I first heard about the UFC in a magazine, and I can still picture the ad because I ripped it out and hung it on my wall, and it hung on my wall through all through high school. It said like karate versus sumo versus judo versus jujitsu, and I was like, this is like actual blood sport, like, the thing that I've always wanted to see, and it's actually happening. I was like, this is going to be insane. And I didn't know if it was anything that I would ever actually be able to see. I didn't, I had no idea. I thought it was just going to be kind of like a one-time thing, but I tore that ad out and hung it on my wall. And the first time I actually saw MMA was my best friend Jason and I walked to the like the little video rental shop in my hometown, and we found UFC 2 on VHS and rented it. We would have been probably 14 or 15 at the time. And I remember sitting cross-legged on the floor, like a few feet from the TV, just like transfixed, like, yes, this is this is what I've been looking for my whole life. And honestly, it was full steam ahead from that moment on. And the only way I could follow it at that time was in magazines. But some of the magazines, the martial arts magazines on the shelves were covering the UFC to some
Mhm.
to some degree. So some of the fighters before I even saw the events, I was reading about it because I didn't really have access to most of the events until kind of later on. They'd come out in I'd get them at the video store or whatever. But yeah, I followed MMA as much as I could through magazines at that time. And then when I started college in the late '90s, that was when I finally had access to the internet, and I practically lived on like the Sherdog forums and uh what's now mixedmartialarts.com used to be submissionfighting.com, and I lived on that forum. And yeah, it was just an absolute obsession from right from the beginning, basically.
Dude, I feel like everyone, well, like when they first get introduced to it, they question whether they're interested or not, and then they just fall into a deep hole of wow, what's going on? And just start. I started rewatching fights when I first started watching the UFC, and I was going back and forth, just UFC one, and then okay, UFC 181, and then I was just going back and forth between the timelines and trying to piece things together. So it was funny. Um, Now I know the people are dying to know. This is completely off topic from the MMA, but what happened to your car hood?
it's it's
Most
kind of funny
popular question
how
I've ever
this.
seen.
Yeah, this is for those of you watching. This is just a reference to a dumb little thing that happened on Twitter a little bit ago, but I'm happy to talk to you about it. There isn't a ton of a story behind it, but I got up to this would have been, I don't know, I was probably 22 or something like that. This would have been probably 2001, 2002, right around there. But I got up to go to work one morning. I lived in a building that had like a fourplex with four apartments in it. And all of the apartments were friends of mine. Like we had all moved into this building and pretty much treated it like a flop house or like a party house, or whatever. But I got up to go to work one morning, and there was feces on the hood of my car, and I did not know where it came from. It looked human. Luckily, I only worked like 5 blocks away, and I didn't feel like dealing with it, so I just walked to work. And then I later found out that a friend of mine had done it when he was drunk, just because he thought it was funny. He took a dump on the hood of my car.
What the?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like trying to piece together how you probably cleaned that up, but we'll save that for another day.
I don't even remember, to be honest. I might have made him do it. I can't remember for sure though.
You woke him up. You're like, "Hey, come downstairs. You're gonna clean this up," and he's all hungover. Now, Eric, what made you start your Twitter page? Was it a personal page that started off as just something you were doing for fun, or did you just straight dive into like the MMA scene?
Yeah, you know, I've had a Twitter page since like probably 2009 or something. I've had one for a long time, but I never used it. Like I was always a Facebook guy, and I would try logging into Twitter and kind of messing around with it a little bit here and there, but it didn't make sense to me. I didn't really get Twitter for a long time. I always was just like, I don't understand how Twitter works. It's so different from Facebook, and that's what I was accustomed to. And so yeah, the Eric Betts Fights Twitter page used to be my personal page, but it probably had like 8 tweets on it or something. And
Mhm.
then, I figured out that the reason that Twitter didn't make sense to me was like, you have to find your community, you have to like find your people, and then it makes sense. Cause on Facebook, you're pretty much only interacting with your friends. And then I would go on Twitter and be like, well, what do I do? Where are my friends? Like, what's going on? And then it's found
Mhm.
out like, oh, Facebook is where you interact with your friends. Twitter is where you interact with strangers who become friends. So now I get it.
Okay. Okay. And how long ago was it when you transitioned into like the MMA side of Twitter?
About a year ago, I think. The,
Okay.
um, the first I first tracked my bets on betmma.tips. October 9th of last year was the first event that I did that. So it's been just over a year, I guess a year and a month since I started tracking. And I'm probably did the Twitter at about the same. I probably switched it over about that same time, I'm guessing.
Nice. Nice. Um, I remember we met through Chris Negron.
Yep,
Good guy. I need to bring him on here too one day.
for sure.
How did you get introduced to him?
Actually, I found his podcast, and it wasn't even through Twitter. I don't think I think I actually just found his podcast like just looking at like the Apple Podcast app, and just kind of
Uh,
scrolling through and looking at different MMA podcasts and stuff. And I found the MMA archive, and I listened to it, and it was right up my alley because I'm a huge fan of the early UFCs, and for those of you listening who aren't familiar, what Chris is doing is with the MMA archive is he started at UFC 1, and he hasn't watched these events. He's watching them for the first time. Like he's not a super new MMA fan, but kind of a newer MMA fan who decided to go back to the beginning and watch all of the UFC and Pride and everything in order. And then he makes an episode for each event and just kind of talks through it and that sort of thing. And I enjoyed listening to his show, and I found him on Twitter, and I just shot him a message and was like, hey man, I like your show. Like, and I hadn't been on any podcasts or anything at this point. So I wasn't even trying to like angle for a guest spot or anything. I was just letting him know that I liked his show. And he was like, hey, you should come on sometime. And I was like, what? Like, like like none of that made it like when I started in this community, I thought that it was going to be like an uphill battle, getting a foot in the door. I thought it was going to be like, yeah, you're nodding like you might have felt the same way a little bit
yeah.
at the beginning. Like I thought it was going to be like,
100%.
I started thinking like, all right, I'm going to start making some YouTube videos, and maybe in like 2 or 3 years, if I really work hard, maybe I'll be able to do a show with like Clint or Manpreet or something. And then it's like, turns out it doesn't really take that long to get your foot in the door and get to know everybody. It's not as big of a community as you might expect. And everybody's for the most part pretty cool. So yeah, he was the first guy to ask me to come on a show, and I was just blown away and like nervous. And I was like, I don't know what to do. And then I find out like, oh, this is actually pretty common once you're kind of
Mhm.
in.
Yeah, because that's pretty much the exact same way I started. I randomly DM'd him about it wasn't the MMA archive show, it was the his breakdown show. And he was like, "You should be on sometime." And I all I can remember is being in the same room. It was dark and I was just jittery. I was so nervous. I didn't know what to do. It was my first time on camera. So, a lot like my first episode of Personality Picks, where I did not know how to speak, and the language of English came a little bit more difficult to me, but a very similar way.
And that first spot you did with Chris was, I might have seen you on Twitter before. I might have like had some idea who you were on Twitter before that, but that I remember seeing that episode where you were with Chris and your first appearance there, and that was kind of when I first got to know who you were as well. So cool.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Now, do you recollect the first fight that you've ever watched? It could be anywhere, whether it's UFC, Pride, uh, any of them.
Well, UFC 2 was the first event that I saw. That was when my friend Jason and I rented it on VHS.
Mhm.
And off the top of my head, I don't remember what the first fight of UFC 2 is, but the fight that stands out to me the most. No, wait, the first fight of UFC 2 I think might be Hoist Gracie and oh man, now I'm putting myself on the spot. What the heck is that?
Was it
He
Ken
was a 5
Shamrock?
foot. What's that?
Was it Ken Shamrock?
No, no, it was this dude. He was an Okinawan karate guy. He was 5'7". I remember that. Um, I could look it up, but now I'm like testing
I'm looking
myself.
it
I
up
want to
right
remember his
now.
name.
I'll let
Uh,
you go for it. Uh,
I think
first,
that was the first fight of UFC 2, but the fight I remember the most from UFC 2 though was Pat Smith versus Scott Morris. So that wasn't the first fight I saw, I don't think, but it was the first fight that I really, really remember. Minoki Ishihara, that's his name. Hoist Gracie versus Minoki Ishihara.
uh-huh, uh-huh. Now, that wasn't the first fight. The first fight was
Wasn't
Scott
it?
Morris and Sean Doherty.
Oh, yeah, that wasn't
Uh-huh.
on that was a dark match though. It wasn't actually on the tape.
Yeah, exactly. But I do see, yeah, Royce Gracie against Ishihara is the first fight that was on the tape. Yep, you're
Uh,
spot on. I could not have remembered that.
And interestingly, Sean and well, it's going to be broken when Rosas Jr. fights, but currently Sean Doherty is the youngest fighter to ever fight in the UFC. That guy who fought Scott Morris there, he was 18 years old in
Mhm.
3 months or so, 4 months,
3
something
months.
like that. But, yeah,
Yeah, isn't it crazy how back in the day it was just everything goes and it was just really one style versus another, where it was like jujitsu versus a Olympian or jujitsu versus a 10-time champion of kickboxing. And when these two matches collide, you just try to see these guys execute their own game plan and just stick to what they know. And I think that's where we see the sport, like how it's evolved over the years. And I think that's the most interesting thing. Because when I first started watching UFC religiously, it was at that time where it was kind of a mix between the specialists versus the well-rounded guys. It was around the era of Conor McGregor first coming up, where he was just like purely a striker for the most part, and then you have like the um, why is his name up? Damien Maya's and those kind of fighters who are just complete specialists that follow their game plan. So it carried a long way until I want to say, correct me if I'm wrong, like 2 years ago, I think is when we started seeing a lot more well-rounded fighters, like a year and a half, 2 years ago.
it's interesting to think about like uh, the style versus style dynamic from the early days is what really drew me to it because I was really interested in traditional martial arts and just martial arts of all kinds. And so, when you're a martial arts nerd, you're always thinking about that, like, oh, what happens if a jujitsu guy fights a sumo wrestler or whatever it might be, like you're always thinking about those kind of things. And yeah, just watching the way, not only the way the sport has developed, but just the way that the onset of mixed martial arts and the evolution of mixed martial arts has evolved martial arts in general, right? I mean, just the way we look at martial arts, the way we think about, uh, watching the Van Damme movies and stuff, where like a fight plays out with a guy jumping in the air and spinning around and kicking people and stuff, and it's like that isn't how fights play out most of the time, And for a long time, we, just as a people, general public, like we thought that was pretty real, like that's how that would go. But yeah, it's been interesting to watch the way the sport has evolved in what you're talking about as far as specialists and then people becoming really well rounded. Like we saw a period of time. Yeah, at first it was like, when Hoist Gracie won 3 of the first 4 UFCs, it's like,
Mhm.
okay, now it's all about BJJ, it's all about grappling. But then we got to a point where there's guys like Chuck Liddell, and it's like, okay, if you're a great striker who can defend takedowns, what's the grappler going to do to you? And it just continues to evolve like that. It's so much fun to watch.
Now, do you have a favorite fighter or a favorite division that you like to watch the most in the UFC?
I've always been a fan of heavyweight, which I know is weird because
Uh,
most people hate heavyweight, but I think it's just I think it's because I was such a fan of the early UFCs. There's a part of me that feels so nostalgic for those early fights that I pine for that in some ways. Like I still love what the UFC is now, but I still go back and watch those early events too because it's impossible to recreate. Kind of like when you discover a new band for the first time, and then
mhm.
usually that first album that you heard from them is the one that you always go back to because it's nostalgic, no matter how good the albums are that come out after it. Like, so that's how the old UFCs are to me. Like, I can't recreate that feeling of watching those by watching the newer UFC, even though I love that too. And I think that's where my connection to heavyweight comes from, is just kind of enjoying those freak show matchups, kind of, like, okay, so
Mhm.
if you look at featherweights or welterweights or whatever, there's going to be some disparity as far as the size and the body type and that sort of thing. But for the most part, a lot of the guys kind of look the same. Whereas you get to heavyweight, you could have two guys that are literally a foot different in height, and one guy's a fat guy, and one guy is a little skinny guy with a long reach. And like, there's still something about that dynamic that's a lot of fun to me. And heavyweight is where it really comes to play the most, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I get what you're trying to say, like 100%, because that was my favorite division when I first started watching the UFC, and it still is one of my favorites. I don't think I have a favorite division right now, so that would be a hard question for me to answer. But if someone were to point a gun to my head and like, you have to tell me right now, what's your favorite division? It would have to be the middleweight division, just because there's so many fighters that are well rounded, and in that division we do see a lot of finishes. I do like the finishing aspect of the martial arts, whether it's by submission or knockout. Fighting to end the fight is way more enjoyable, especially like to a casual fan, let alone to people that are like diehards, than just watching a 3 round decision. Even though we've had a bunch of great 3 round decisions or 5 round decisions in the past, but that's just me.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, everybody loves a good knockout or a good submission, right? So it's like, so when you try to explain, like when I say, oh, heavyweight's my favorite division, then it's like, then people are going to get in their head like, okay, well, this is a guy who doesn't appreciate high level skills and only appreciates like sloppy knockouts and stuff like that. And I can see that. But if you think about what makes us enjoy mixed martial arts, and I suppose it's different for everybody, but yeah, we enjoy seeing. I mean, when a guy comes out and it's clearly a mismatch and blows another guy out of the water with a quick knockout or quick submission, that's enjoyable to watch, right? But at the
Mhm.
same time, two guys who are both very high level and are very well matched having a 25-minute long chess match, that's really fun to watch too, right? We kind of need both, I think.
100%, 100%. And when you have the styles that collide, where it's like someone that's very opportunistic finisher going against someone that's maybe mainly just a decision fighter, that's where I feel like it's the most where I anticipate it the most, because you never know what's gonna happen. Who's gonna execute their game plan to the fullest and take advantage of the opportunity. Because it could be a dude that's just laying on you and is not doing nothing, or the other guy's just bonking them left and right. Yeah, it's so fun. Now,
Absolutely.
how did you get into like the betting aspect of UFC? Because that's a fun question that a lot of people have had different answers for on the show.
Yeah, I've always been interested in gambling. Just
Mhm,
I've always I've always liked casinos. Like there's something about just kind of a seedy, I don't know. I've always just been attracted to like the seedy underbelly of society, if that makes any sense. And there's just something about casinos that I've always really loved. I mean, from the time I was first turned 18 and was able to step into casinos, I would go as often as I could. I've just always really enjoyed them. I always really enjoyed blackjack. I really enjoyed
mhm.
poker. I was just really drawn to all of that. And so, being a huge MMA fan, I guess it all kind of connected together. But I was thinking about this earlier and I was going to try to figure out exactly which fight it was, but I was like, "Oh, I should try to figure out what was the first fight that I ever bet on." And I know three early ones. I don't know which one was first. I think the first fight I ever bet on was a Sakuraba fight in Pride, but I don't remember who he was fighting.
Mhm.
But the two that I do remember is I bet on, I think it was the second Liddell Randy Couture fight. I bet $50 on Randy Couture and he lost. And then I also bet on, before Jorge Masvidal got his flying knee on Ben Askren, this fight was the fastest knockout in UFC history. Dwayne Ludwig versus Jonathan Goulet. I bet on Dwayne Ludwig in that fight. So this would have been maybe around, I don't know, 2006 or something like that. So those were the first fights I ever bet on, but I had no clue what I was doing. I don't even like, it must have been an offshore book. I don't even know what book it was or anything. I don't even remember how all that played out, but I didn't even know what money lines were. I didn't know how much money I was going to get back, or I didn't understand anything. I was just like, I'm going to put $50 on Randy Couture. And then, but it was never a regular thing. I think it was literally like, I put in $50. I bet it on Randy Couture. I lost it and was just like, oh, well, that sucked. And then I didn't start betting fights. Well, I'd say about 8 years ago or so, I actually subscribed to Luca Fiori's service for a while.
Huh.
So I was betting fights regularly then using 5 dimes. And then I eventually quit doing that. And then I loved listening to betting breakdowns and stuff, and I was always like taking notes and writing picks and all that stuff, but I wasn't betting on fights. I didn't really have an easy way to do it. I suppose I could have gotten an offshore account or whatever, but I didn't really start betting on fights regularly until maybe 3 years ago, 4 years ago, something like that.
Okay, and how would you describe your betting style? Is it more risk averse? Is it risky? Somewhere in the middle?
I feel like I'm still figuring that out to some degree, but
Mhm.
um, I would say my initial betting style, like when I first do the tape, like early on in the week, my initial betting style is pretty cautious, and then I pull the trigger on a bunch of dumb stuff at the last minute before like Friday night or Saturday morning or something. Whatever spots I was rolling around in my head, I'm just like, whatever, yeah, let's do these two. So like, I sometimes I want to go back through and like figure out like, what if I hadn't made all these last minute dumb bets? What would my track record look like? But my unit size is very small. I don't have a big bankroll at all. And so I think that has a pretty big effect on the way that I bet. I am a little more loosey goosey and just kind of shotgunning stuff out there, because if I lose, it's not really that big of a deal. And I do think about that sometimes. Like I wish I had more money to like make a big bankroll, because it would change the way I bet. It would change the way I
Mhm.
think about this, because if I was losing a couple $100 every time I lost a bet, that's going to make me think about it a lot more differently than when I'm losing 20-30 bucks here and there.
Yeah, I completely understand that because when I first started betting, it wasn't UFC, believe it or not. It was mainly NBA, and it was a specific prop. It was players to get more than 2.5 3-pointers, so three or more. And back then, I remember I was betting like 20 or 25 bucks on these props, and I would be sweating. I'm nervous. I'm like, oh, what's going on? Why is he not making these 3-pointers? And like the way it's transitioned now that I'm more comfortable with like bigger amounts, I think, yeah, you're 100% spot on. It changes the way that you bet. It changes how cautious you are, how much research you put into it. You can put in a lot of research even betting these small amounts, but you take it way more seriously, I feel, when the amounts are bigger because there's more at stake, if that makes sense too.
For sure. Yeah, because I mean, really, I treat betting right now like I do my homework as much as I can, but it's one of those things that obviously I have a family and a full-time job and I run a
Mhm.
business on the side, and like when I first started doing this, I was spending way too much time on tape. I mean, I was spending, it was just, that's kind of why I like fell off for a little bit there and wasn't putting out any content and wasn't really doing anything, as I was like, I need to just kind of rejigger this whole thing and figure out how this is going to fit into my life, because
Yeah.
I don't know. We all do that with stuff, right? You get excited about something and you just go too hard. And now I'm doing 4 or 5 shows a week and blah, 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 whatever. And I was just like, yeah, this is not going to work long term. I got to figure out. And I'm spending 2 hours a fight on tape and stuff, and it just got to be way too much. But I've tried to like shorten the time I'm spending on tape now, and figure out how to make it all fit. But for the most part, because my unit size is so small, I just think of it like a game. It's like a
Mhm.
hobby. It's no different from, I mean, besides the fact that I'm trying to give myself an edge rather than just chance, it's no different than going to the casino and sitting down at a slot machine, or going to play poker with some friends or something. I'm just having fun. I'm not even thinking about it as a way to make money. And so I'd like to at some point, and all I'd have to do is budget and plan a little bit and just decide I'm going to do it. Like, all right, it's time to set aside some money and get a bankroll going here and actually make a run at this
Mhm.
with the mindset of like, hey, if you lose bets, you're losing some money here, rather than thinking of it as a game. Because yeah, I definitely think it would make a difference. And there's a lot of spots I pull the trigger on that I wouldn't if there was another zero or two tacked on to the amount that I'm wagering.
Yeah. I find myself to be a lot like you, where it's like also last minute I'll place like a couple of random bets, like smaller amounts, but untracked, just so I want to have some action, some skin in the game. And there's like, say I have like a 3 or 4 fight break where there's no bets. I'm like, what am I doing? I'm watching nothing. But also, I need to step back from that because sometimes that can hurt.
Yeah, for sure. I do that same thing, and that's one of the things I specifically think would change if I was putting more money out. Because yeah, if I was betting entirely to make money, if I was like, okay, this is my thing, I'm trying to win at this. Yeah, I wouldn't care if I had one or two bets on the card, right? But I do the same thing you do. I look and I'm like, okay, the bets I have now are like smart, and I think I should just stick with those. But even though I like watching fights without having action on the fights, it sure makes it a whole lot more fun. So yeah, I'll look and be like, man, I don't have anything on like the first four fights. Like I'm gonna be watching the fights, but I'm gonna be scrolling my phone, dinking around, playing games or something. I need to do something, so I'm gonna be locked in. I got to put some bets down.
It's hilarious. Well, speaking about fights, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and we're gonna look ahead to UFC Vegas 64, and we're gonna do a rapid fire pick 'em, just going from bottom to top. And we'll start off with the first fight of the night. It's Ramona Pascual against the future champion Tamiris Vidal. Who you got?
I like Pasquale quite a bit there. Probably by decision, maybe a late finish, but yeah, I think Pasquale should win that.
Yeah, I know Pascual's your girl.
Here she is.
Cool. Next up, we have Jake Hadley against Carlos Candelaria.
I like Hadley there, but I think the line is a little wide, and I don't like a bet on him there. But I think he should win, but I don't favor him as much as minus 250, minus 300, whatever the heck he's at now.
Hmm. Yeah, I think the issue with him is that he's just too comfortable playing in his own guard, and I don't think he
Hmm.
realizes that loses him the fight.
Yep.
But anyways, next up we have Johnny Munoz Jr. against Sholinian.
This was my fight that I don't, every week there's at least one where I'm just like, I don't really feel like I have a strong read here. I don't really have a strong read on who's going to win, but I do think that Sholinian plus 200 is pretty good value. I feel like the fight probably plays out more closely than that, but I'm not confident enough in my read to be like, yes, pull the trigger there. But I feel like, if you bet Sholinian at plus 200, I feel like this fight's going to play out in a way where you're going to be glad you did, but we'll see.
I tend to agree. Cool. Next up we have Jinyu Fry against Polyana Viana.
I'm not sure on that one. I'm going to go screw it. I'm going to go Ginny Fry by decision. I might have just flip flopped on that. I can't even remember what I said before, but I think, I think Viana, she's maybe not entirely reliant on the sub here to win, but maybe fairly reliant on the sub if it goes to decision. And I think Viana's got some reach, is pretty good at using her length and her
Mhm.
kicks. But I think Fry is the better striker, the better boxer, and should be able to outvolume her.
So far we've agreed on every single fight. Next up we have Mario Bautista against Benito Lopez.
Yeah, I'm not going to get into this one too much. Everybody's heard all the jokes already, but I think Bautista should cruise there. I mean, if Lopez could surprise us, but I don't see it happening.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. Miranda Maverick against Shanna Young. This is a rematch.
Yep, yeah, same thing. I don't necessarily know that she gets her out of there as quick as she did in the first fight, but I do have a bet on Maverick inside the distance. I think she should be able to handle it.
Hmm. We have the same bet there. We're literally like reading minds here. It's the same exact thing. This one's gonna be interesting because I've seen different picks all over Twitter too. So Derek Minner against Shailan Nurdenbeke.
I did put a sprinkle on Derek Minner by sub in round one, but as far as a pick, I think I'm going to lean Shah Yulan. I'm going to lean toward thinking that Minner doesn't find that sub, and Shah Yulan probably finishes him, maybe ground and pound later in the fight.
All right, all right. I'm leaning towards that second option that you were giving out because I think Shyamalan is able to defend the sub at a pretty high rate, and he can boink him. I think so. This is gonna be a fun one. Mark Madsen against Grant Dawson.
Yeah, that's a tough fight to. This is another spot. I feel like a little bit like the Hadley Candelario. Like I do favor Dawson here, but it seems potentially a little wide to me. You know, Dawson is the more well-rounded the more complete mixed martial artist, but Madsen is good at what he does, and he's improved his striking somewhat. But again, this is one of those that, like, if the fight plays out closely, I'm not going to be surprised. If Dawson
Mhm.
dominates for 15 minutes, I'm not going to be surprised either. So I don't feel like I know what's going to happen in this one.
Yeah, because Mark Madsen just finds his way on the back and just holds people down to the floor, and that's his game. So I wouldn't be surprised if that happens and he cashes as an underdog here. But next up, we have Tagir Lembekov against Nate Maness.
I like Tagir there. I did bet Tagir's money line early on. I think I got him at minus 175. I think he's like minus 210 range now.
Mhm.
If he can't get the takedowns and keep Maness down, you know, it's going to get hairy for him. It's going to get dangerous. But you know, we've definitely seen Maness taken down and held down, and I lean toward thinking Tagir will be able to do the same. Patrick's here.
Shout out to Pat. Cool. Next up, we have the people's main event, and specifically Lou's favorite fight on the card: Josh Parisian against Chase Sherman, the Yambag special.
Chase Sherman round 3 KO. Always.
Whoa. Okay, that's a different take. I like it. I might have to bet that one myself. Cool. Co-main event, we have Neil Magny against Daniel Rodriguez.
I've decided that I like Magny here. I had a little trouble figuring this one out from the tape, and then afterwards, I just kind of sat down and thought about. You know, I kind of got a little, maybe a little narrative based in my head, but I for me, it ended up coming down to just thinking about Magny's been in there with everybody. He's seen it all. He's done it all. He's a wily veteran who knows how to handle a variety of styles. You know, D Rod can crack. He might be able to drop him. He might be able to get him out of there. But if he can't, I think Magny should be able to, uh, you know, get his way to his 17th UFC decision. I think.
Yeah, that one's a toss-up for me too, because we hear all the news about D-Rod having his elbow injury that pulled him out of his last fight, and Neil Magny hasn't really looked all that impressive in his past 2, 3 fights either. So um, it's gonna be a fun one, but I don't think I'm gonna be having any money at stake in there.
No, me
Then we
neither.
move to the main event: Marina Rodriguez against Amanda Lemos.
I do like Rodriguez there. It's another spot where I feel like the line might be a little wide just because of how dangerous Lemos is, especially early. So, you know, I feel like it's one of those spots where Lemos is going to be dangerous for the first couple rounds. You know, she doesn't death gas completely or anything, but she becomes a little less effective as the fight goes
Mhm.
on. I think, you know, there's a little less pop on her shots. A little she becomes just a little less technical, a little more loosey goosey. For people who have access to that Rodriguez 3-4-5 decision or 4-5 decision or whatever, I think that's a really good bet. I don't have access to that one, but that's what I'd be doing if I did.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you on that because I do think, like, especially in the Angela Hill fight, Lemos just looked like a completely different fighter in that third round, and she was getting pieced up. That was a hairy decision that went my way, thankfully. So I thank the UFC judges and the UFC gods for looking out for me. But I don't think she won that fight.
Right.
Cool. Well, Eric, let the people know where they can find you, what you have going on, any upcoming shows, and we'll close this one out.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks everybody for watching. This is cool. Thanks for supporting Wiz, what he does in this show, and you know he's putting out free bets on all the sports all the time. I've been following some of those, you know, tailing some of those here and there, and having a pretty good time with it. But yeah, you can find me on Twitter at ErikBetsFights, on Instagram at Erik_bets_fights, on YouTube if you just search ErikBetsFights. Um, yeah, I'm always down to chat with new people on Twitter or whatever. So go ahead and add me, shoot me a message, and let's have some fun watching fights.
Yes, sir. And Eric, thank you for taking the time and coming on the show. It means a lot, and it was really fun. So hopefully we'll have you back on once I make this the whole Twitter space round, and then we'll do
Right.
another episode. That'll be fun.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, brother. Have a good night.
See you guys.